When it comes to finding love today, you've basically got two choices, right? You can dive into the world of dating apps, or you can hope for that classic in-person meet cute. It feels like a massive decision, but does the path you choose actually affect how happy you end up? That's what we're digging into today.
Okay, let's get right into it because this is a question so many of us are asking. You hear all sorts of things that apps are just for superficial flings, or that meeting someone organically is a fantasy from old movies. We're going to cut through all that chatter and look at what the research actually tells us. Does that first hello really determine the happily ever after?
And look, we're not just going off of opinions or stories from friends. Everything we're talking about today is based on this peer-reviewed study. It was designed to do one thing and one thing only: compare how satisfied couples are depending on whether they met on an app or the old-fashioned way.
So, the study really focuses on these two very different ways of connecting. You've got the digital route and you've got the real world in person route. Let's quickly break down what the research sees as the good and the bad of each. So, on one side, dating apps are just amazingly convenient, right? You get access to a massive pool of people. But the research flags some real issues. Conversations can be pretty superficial, and there's this thing called the paradox of choice, which is basically that feeling of being so overwhelmed with options that you can't commit, because you're always wondering if someone better is just one swipe away. Then, on the other side, meeting someone offline gives you all those crucial face-to-face cues right from the start, which helps build a real connection. But, of course, it relies a whole lot more on just being in the right place at the right time. And that brings us right to the heart of it all, the satisfaction question. I mean, if you're trying to decide where to invest your time and energy, you want to know if one of these paths actually leads to a happier relationship. Well, this is where it starts to get really interesting.
You'd think there'd be a clear winner, wouldn't you? But nope, it's not nearly that simple. Before this particular study, the scientific research on this topic was kind of all over the map. The results were actually pretty conflicting.
And you can really see that conflict right here. For instance, one study by an author named Remington, it found pretty much no difference in satisfaction between online and offline couples. But then another study came along from Sharabi and their colleagues, and they found that people who met online were actually a little bit less satisfied in their marriages. So you've got this disagreement, which is exactly why this new study was so necessary. And that leads us to the main event. The study we're focusing on today, it was basically designed to clear up all that confusion and put this question to the test once and for all. So here's how they did it. Researchers got a hold of 273 people, all of them in relationships. Now, of that group, 110 had met their partner on a dating app, and the other 163 had met in a more traditional, offline way. And to measure their happiness, they used a proper scientific tool called the Couple Satisfaction Index to get solid, reliable data. Okay, so this is it, the moment of truth. They've got the people, they've got the method. So who was happier, the app daters or the traditional daters? And here you have it. The results are pretty clear. The group that met through traditional offline methods, they scored an average of 4.12 out of 5 on the satisfaction scale. And the group that met on dating apps, their average was 3.45. You can see a pretty obvious gap there. Now, the most important part here is that this wasn't just some tiny random difference. In the world of science, this is what's called statistically significant. And that's just a fancy way of saying that it's extremely unlikely this result was a fluke. It's pointing to a real pattern. All right, so knowing what the study found is one thing, but the real million-dollar question is why? Why did the people who met offline report being happier? Let's get into how the researchers tried to explain this. Well, the study points to a few big challenges that are just sort of built into the dating app experience. First, there's that paradox of choice we mentioned. Having what feels like infinite options can make you less satisfied with the choice you actually make. Then there's the whole issue of misrepresentation, when profiles don't quite match up with reality. And finally, there's ghosting. Getting abruptly cut off can create a ton of anxiety, and that's just not a great way to start any kind of relationship.
On the flip side, traditional dating just has some natural strengths. You get that face-to-face time from the get-go, so you can read body language and tone of voice, all the little things that build trust. You often meet while doing something together, which creates an instant bond, and all of that can lead to a sense of security that's just a lot harder to find when you start with a digital profile. And honestly, this quote from the study just hits the nail on the head. It says that dating apps can lead to superficial exchanges, where the focus shifts to quantity over quality. In other words,
The way the apps are designed can sometimes turn dating into a game of collecting matches instead of building one really great connection.
So, after looking at all this data, what are you supposed to do with it? If you're single and looking, does this mean you should just delete all your apps immediately? Well, the study actually suggests a smarter, more thoughtful approach. See, the big takeaway here isn't to just say apps bad, offline good. It's about being a savvy dater no matter where you're looking. The goal is just to be aware of the pros and cons of each path so you can navigate them with your eyes wide open.
So, what does that mindful strategy actually look like? Well, first, if you're going to use apps, just go in with realistic expectations. Know that things like ghosting might happen. Second, actively be aware of that paradox of choice and try to resist that endless swiping for perfect. And finally, just remember that no matter how you meet, the real work and the real reward comes from actually building and nurturing that connection over time.
And so we'll leave you with a final question to really think about. Now that you know the potential upsides and downsides of each approach, what do you value most when you're looking for a partner? Is it the convenience of apps, the security of meeting through friends, or that little bit of magic from a chance encounter? Because understanding your own answer to that question is probably the best guide you'll ever have.